The first thing Elias noticed wasn't the blood, or the cold, or the fact that his apartment door was inexplicably ajar. It was the perfect, sterile silence of his feed. Elias Thorne was an amateur archivist of digital anomalies, a self-proclaimed digital archaeologist. His life revolved around a single, massive monitor that illuminated his tiny, perpetually dim New York apartment. For the past 6 months, he'd been tracking something elusive, something he'd privately named the Empty Channel. It was a ghost in the machine, a YouTube channel with 0 subscribers, 0 videos, and a channel banner that was just a single, pure black pixel. But the oddity wasn't it existing. The oddity was that it was constantly being suggested to him. Every refresh, every new session, every time he opened the app on his phone, the Empty Channel sat there, usually 3rd or 4th in the recommendations list, sandwiched between 20 cute cats reacting to cucumbers and the most dangerous deep-sea creatures. It was an algorithmic impossibility. A channel with no data should be invisible. Tonight, however, the silence was different. Elias had been deep into a rabbit hole, watching a late-night stream of a forgotten 1980s public access show, The Quiet Hour, a surreal, low-budget show about a man who just sat in a chair and stared at the camera for 30 minutes. He'd paused it to grab a soda from his tiny fridge. When he returned, the video was gone. Not buffered, not crashed. The entire window had been replaced by a blank gray screen. Then came the silence. His entire feed, the constant, flowing river of data, noise, and visual clutter that had been the backdrop to his existence for a decade, had dried up. The sidebar was blank. The homepage was a void. There were no recommendations. Elias felt a cold spike of genuine fear, a fear that transcended his usual curiosity. This wasn't a server error. This was a system-wide digital heart attack, confined solely to his machine. He tried to search for the Quiet Hour. Nothing. He tried news. Nothing. Even a simple search for weather returned an error message he'd never seen before, rendered in a font that was slightly too small, slightly too sharp. Data _ error as he glanced at the time in the bottom corner of his monitor. 2:07 a.m. That's when he saw at point one single video suggestion had materialized on the empty homepage. It wasn't in the usual format. It was just a small, crude thumbnail. A blurry, greenish image that looked like a close-up of something wet and decaying, floating alone in the digital expanse. The title, rendered in a plain white font. The Archivist's Door, 1/12. Elias's blood ran cold. The Archivist. That was his private, ironic nickname for himself. And 1/12? Was this related to the 12-part horror story he'd been contemplating writing? He didn't hesitate. He had to know. He clicked it. The video didn't load a typical player. It didn't buffer. It snapped into place, full screen, instantly. The image was a static shot, utterly black, but with a barely perceptible texture, like rough concrete in a moonless night. There was no audio. After 10 seconds of this absolute blackness, a single line of text flashed white across the center of the screen, staying for only 1 second. Look up from your screen, Elias. Your door is open. Elias shot up from his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cold spike of fear turned into a paralyzing dread. He spun around. The digital silence was now mirrored by the real-world silence of his apartment. The street noise had vanished. The low, comforting hum of the city was gone. And across the room, his cheap, wooden apartment door, the one he always triple-locked, was indeed cracked open, a sliver of hallway blackness visible. It wasn't just a coincidence. He knew it. The video hadn't just told him to look. The video had known he slowly walked toward the door, his bare feet sticking slightly to the wood floor. He reached out and, with a trembling hand, pushed the door the rest of the way open. The hallway was pitch black. The motion sensor light on the ceiling, which usually flickered on at the slightest change in pressure or movement, remained resolutely dark. But what stole his breath, what made him stifle a scream, wasn't the darkness that it was the scent that a thick, metallic, undeniably fresh smell of copper and iron. The smell of a large amount of blood was pouring out of the hallway and into his apartment. Elias recoiled, his hand flying to his mouth. He looked back at his monitor. The video was still there, the black screen. But now, another line of text was appearing, slowly, painfully slow, one white letter at a time, like a typewriter from hell. You were searching for the ghost. Now, the algorithm has suggested you. Elias didn't move. He stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the digital terror on his screen and the tangible, horrifying reality of the hallway. The metallic stench of blood was overwhelming, making his eyes water and his stomach clenched. It has to be a mistake. Someone else's door. A drunk neighbor. A prank. But the cold, calculated message on his monitor, "Your door is open," shredded that comfort. He risked a glance back at the screen. The text had disappeared. The blackness was back, still, silent, waiting that he needed light. His apartment was lit only by the eerie blue-white glow of his monitor. He fumbled for his phone in his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it. It clattered against the floor, and the faint thud sounded deafening in the unnatural silence. He picked it up, unlocked it, and quickly activated the flashlight app. The beam cut a shaky, narrow cone through the black oil slick of the hallway. He swept the beam left, toward the stairwell. Nothing. Just the peeling, institutional beige wallpaper and the closed door of Mrs. Rodriguez, his elderly neighbor across the hall. He swept the beam right, toward the elevator. That's where the light stopped. About 3 feet from his doorway, on the threadbare carpet, was a dark, wet, Rorschach blot of crimson. It was huge, at least 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, and still looked strangely slick in the harsh phone light. It wasn't a stain, it was a pool. Elias choked back a sob. This wasn't a nosebleed or a cut finger. This was catastrophe. He took a step back, hitting the wall of his apartment. He was about to slam his door shut, to triple lock it and barricade himself in, when his light beam flickered down, catching something small and shiny on the edge of the blood pool. That it was a keycard. That he knew that card. It was a generic white magnetic entry card, the kind his landlord issued for the roof access and the laundry room in the basement. Against every survival instinct screaming in his head, the digital archivist inside Elias took over. He needed data. He needed to know the source. This wasn't just a physical threat. It was the intersection of his digital anomaly and physical space, the realization of the nightmare the algorithm had been suggesting. Holding his breath, he knelt, keeping his knees clear of the blood. He plucked the card off the carpet by its edge, careful not to smear the card or the small, faint, spatter pattern around it. It felt cold and oddly warm at the same time. He flipped it over. There was a sticker on the back, a small, faded circular label that usually denoted the card number. But the number was scratched out. Instead, someone, or something, had used a thick, permanent marker to scrawl 3 letters. L.H.L. Elias stared at the initials. They meant nothing to him. Then, he heard it. That it was a sound so soft, so subtle, that he almost dismissed it as a pulsing in his own ear. It was a faint, rhythmic scraping coming from somewhere down the hall beyond the elevator. It sounded like fingernails dragging lightly across dry concrete. He spun the flashlight beam back toward the elevator, aiming further down the corridor. The scraping stopped instantly, replaced by a profound, heavy silence that felt like the atmosphere pressing down on him. He was being watched. His phone vibrated violently in his hand, almost making him drop it again. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a text. It was the YouTube app pushing a notification. He pulled the phone away from the hallway and looked at the screen. A new message from the empty channel, the channel that had no videos. The card opens the basement. Follow the trail, Elias. The algorithm rewards the curious. A cold, horrifying realization washed over Elias. The keycard was a literal hook. The algorithm was luring him, using his compulsion for data and his fear of the unknown, and the trail it wanted him to follow. He looked back at the pool of blood. It was a straight line from his door to the spot where the keycard had fallen, but the light of his phone caught something he hadn't noticed before, glinting wetly inside the crimson pool. It was a tiny, reflective shard, a piece of broken plastic. Elias leaned in, focusing the light. The shard was part of a larger object. He looked closely at the pattern and shape of the broken piece. It wasn't a piece of glass. It was a fragment of a camera lens, the kind of lens that would have belonged to a small, worn, discreet action camera. Someone, or something, had been filming this. And they had been filmed right here, at his door, before they, or their camera, was brutally destroyed. Elias Thorne, the digital archivist, the man who hunted anomalies, knew he had just stumbled into the most dangerous footage of his life. And the director was demanding he step into the scene. The fragment of the camera lens felt like a piece of evidence ripped from a horror film, except the star of the film was Elias. He closed his fingers tightly around the keycard and the plastic shard, the cold of the magnet mixing with the sharpness of the broken lens. He had two choices, both terrifying: retreat and call the police, or descend and confront the source of the anomaly. Calling the police felt useless. What would he tell them? There's a huge pool of blood in my hallway, and YouTube told me to go to the basement. They'd assume a drug overdose or a mental break. The digital element, the true, terrifying variable, would be dismissed if this was a game. Elias was already past the point of no return. His digital obsession demanded resolution. He had to follow the trail. He quickly slipped back into his apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked all 3 deadbolts, creating a momentary, false sense of security. He moved to the monitor, where the black screen of the ARCHIVIST'S DOOR, 1/12, was waiting. That he needed gear. He grabbed his essentials, a heavy-duty, industrial flashlight from his emergency kit, a small, cheap digital recorder, always ready to capture strange audio, his thickest, oldest, and most reliable baseball bat. Leaning against the wall, he clipped the recorder to his belt and gripped the bat tightly, its worn wooden weight offering a meager comfort. Before leaving, he stared at his screen one last time. He suddenly noticed a minuscule, almost unseeable white cursor, a tiny arrow, had appeared on the black canvas. It was slowly, deliberately, tracing a path down and to the left. The direction of the basement. That you're watching me. You're directing me, Elias thought, his mind racing between terror and a strange, manic excitement. He unlocked the door. The copper stench hit him immediately, but now Elias moved with focus. He stepped over the blood and aimed his powerful flashlight down the hall. The rhythmic scraping sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the end of the hall. It was coming from below him. He reached the stairwell landing. The apartment building was an old, poorly maintained structure. The stairs were concrete, covered in decades of chipped paint and dust. The light was broken, plunging the descent into absolute darkness. He looked down. His heart leaped. The thick, wet trail of blood didn't stop at the pool near his door. It continued, smeared, spattered, and dragged down the center of the concrete steps, following the descent like a grotesque, crimson banister. The scraping sound was the dragging of something heavy across the gritty concrete. He started down, one slow, deliberate step after another, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive black. The sound of his own breathing felt like an intruder. With every step, the scent intensified, becoming less metallic and more organic, like stale meat left in a warm room. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. He passed the first-floor landing. The scraping was clearly audible now, perhaps 20 steps below. Then, the dragging stopped. Silence. Elias froze, bat raised, listening so intently his ears began to ring. Had it hurt him? His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the notification from the empty channel. The subject is waiting. Elias rounded the final corner of the stairwell, and the basement door came into view. It was heavy steel, painted a dull gray, with a rusty pushbar and a small, magnetic card reader beside it. And there, right in front of the basement door, was the end of the blood trail. The IT didn't just stop. It widened into a disturbing, chaotic delta of smears and foot-shaped prints, as if something had violently thrashed against the door. There was a sickening detail, a small, dark object pressed into the blood near the door hinge. Elias crept closer, his industrial flashlight focused on the object. That IT was a human tooth, cracked and stained dark red. That he gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. L.H.L was in trouble. L.H.L was dragged. He took the white keycard from his pocket, the card the algorithm had. No one was there. He held his breath, placed the card against the reader, and swiped down. The card reader immediately flashed a defiant, pulsing red light, accompanied by a sharp, high-pitched ERRRT sound that ripped through the silence. Elias cursed under his breath. The card was dead. Or wrong. He stared at the broken tooth. He stared at the red light. The algorithm had lured him, but it hadn't provided the key. He began frantically searching the walls and floor around the door, shining his light everywhere, desperate for an alternative. His light caught a small, almost invisible detail on the steel door, near the hinge, where the thrashed blood had smeared thickest. A single, tiny panel of the paint had been scratched away. That he knelt down, pressing the light right against the spot. The scratch was not random. It formed a crude, almost microscopic symbol, barely visible beneath the dried blood spatter. It was the same symbol that appeared, for a millisecond, on the loading screen of the infamous Quiet Hour public access stream he had been watching just hours before. A strange, intersecting glyph that looked like a circle with two small, hooked lines slashing through it. He touched the bare steel. It was freezing to as his finger touched the exposed metal. His digital recorder, clipped to his belt, suddenly started playing back the last audio it had captured, not from Elias, but from the hall. A faint, distorted, agonizing whisper, layered with static. Don't use the card. The key is the blood. Then a louder sound, a deep, wet thump from the other side of the heavy steel door. The subject was waiting. And the archivist realized the algorithm didn't want him to open the door. It wanted him to feed it. The whispered message echoing from his digital recorder. The key is the blood. Slammed into Elias with the force of a physical blow. The meaning was sickeningly clear, a twisted logic only the algorithm could conceive. The keycard had failed. The broken tooth and the frantic struggle against the door suggested L.H.L had been trying to escape, or possibly get in before being overpowered. And the glyph, the symbol from the obscure, hypnotic public access show, was the final, cryptic clue. Elias stared at the thick, wet pool of blood surrounding the door. The basement access was secured by a biometric lock, but not one that read fingerprints or iris scans. It needed a different kind of signature. A wet signature. He lowered the baseball bat and shone the powerful flashlight directly onto the magnetic card reader. The red light was still throbbing, a silent, mocking beacon. The design of the reader was simple, a narrow plastic slot for the card, and a small, smooth square panel slightly below it, probably an indicator light or a scanner. That he reached into the thickest part of the blood pool near the door hinge. The viscosity was nauseating, like lukewarm jelly. He pulled his hand back, his index finger now coated in the sticky, dark liquid. Every rational voice screamed at him to stop. This was evidence, crime scene material. He was contaminating everything, sealing his own fate. But the fear of the unknown, the fear of failure to solve the anomaly, was now a stronger primal drive than self-preservation. He lifted his blood-slicked finger and, aiming for the small, square panel below the card slot, smeared the blood across the plastic. The red light on the card reader died. For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence and the sickening shine of blood. Then, the panel slowly, deliberately, began to glow. Not green, the color of typical access. It pulsed with a cold, sickly violet light. A low, mechanical clunk echoed from inside the steel door, the sound of the magnetic lock disengaging. The push bar was now unlocked. Elias's breath hitched. He had done it. He had satisfied the lock's requirement. His phone buzzed one last time. He didn't even have to look at the notification. He knew the message. He felt its digital presence like a cold wind. Welcome to the archive. Proceed with caution. He gripped the bat again, the handle slippery with sweat. He looked down the dark, cavernous hole of the basement stairwell, which smelled of mildew, dust, and now, overwhelmingly, blood. He pushed the heavy steel door open. It didn't swing freely. There was a terrible, soft resistance, a squishing, tearing sound as the door scraped against something lying just inside the threshold. He forced it wider, shining his light into the immediate interior. What he saw was a nightmare arranged with meticulous, chilling precision. The source of the resistance wasn't a body or a limb. It was a pile of clothing. A man's jeans, a worn hoodie, and a pair of cheap work boots, all soaked through and flattened into a damp, crimson heap right at the entry. They were clearly L.H.L. But the disturbing element was what was pinned to the pile. Using a thin, rusted nail, a single, handwritten note was pinned directly to the center of the hoodie. Elias stepped over the pile of empty clothes, his boots sinking slightly into the bloody carpet of the stairwell, and aimed his light at the note. It was written in neat, elegant cursive, a stark contrast to the brutality surrounding it. The subjectwas corrupted. The host rejecteth a download. Wirchiv Thetrunumalius bellowed. Don't Lucathuls for too long, Elias. Thesalence. As Elias finished reading, the electronic door behind him didn't clunk or whir. It simply slid shut with a soft, final whoosh, plunging him into the total darkness of the basement. The violet light of the reader vanished. Panic seized him. He whirled around and slammed his shoulder against the push bar. It was locked again. Solid steel. No handle. No way out, but the way the algorithm wanted him to go. He turned back, alone in the oppressive blackness, the flashlight beam his only tether to sanity. The basement wasn't like the hallway. It wasn't just dusty. It was a labyrinth of low-hanging pipes, concrete columns, and stacks of decades-old, tarp-covered junk. He turned on his digital recorder, its faint red light now his beacon. He took his first step past the pile of archived clothing, following the path L.H.L. had been dragged, and then he heard the first sound that wasn't him. It wasn't a scrape or a thump. It was a low, rhythmic, high-pitched hum, vibrating through the air like 1,000 angry, trapped wasps. It seemed to emanate not from one direction, but from the very bones of the building. And with the hum came the distinct, sickly sweet aroma of ozone and burned electronics, mixing impossibly with the overwhelming stench of decay. The archivist, trapped in the physical space of his digital obsession, knew he was standing at the core of the anomaly. The air in the basement was thick, cold, and charged with an almost painful energy. The high-pitched, vibrating hum resonated deep in Elias's skull, like a sustained note of pure digital distress. The smell of ozone and burnt wiring was a horrifying confirmation. This anomaly wasn't just biological, it was technological. Elias kept the industrial flashlight beam steady, sweeping it slowly across the damp, concrete floor. The trail of blood was still visible, a winding, dark path leading deeper into the subterranean maze. He passed towering stacks of debris, broken furniture, rusted boilers, and mounds of cardboard boxes. The low ceiling was a web of pipes dripping cold condensation, each drop sounding unnervingly loud against the pervasive hum. Don't look at the walls for too long. They listened to the silence. The chilling instruction from the note repeated in his mind that he focused his beams strictly on the floor, following the blood trail which, here in the darkness, appeared almost black. The blood had begun to thin and break up, not from being cleaned, but as if the source of the dragging was lessening the amount of fluid it was leaving behind. The hum intensified as he walked, becoming so loud it felt like it was tearing at the fabric of the silence. His cheap digital recorder was picking it up, displaying a rapid, chaotic waveform on its tiny screen, but the sound it played back was nothing but static and distortion. He finally rounded a column and stopped dead. The blood trail ended here, not with another body or pile of clothes, but with a perfectly formed circle of dried, flaked-off blood about the size of a dinner plate. It was a destination marker. Surrounding this circle were over a dozen identical, plain brown cardboard boxes. They weren't organized. They were simply placed on the floor in a loose, jagged cluster. Each box was sealed shut with clear packing tape. Elias approached cautiously, bat held high. He shone his light on the boxes. They looked innocuous, like storage for holiday decorations or old taxes. But their placement, centered around the ritualistic blood circle, was profoundly unsettling. That he noticed something else. On the top of each box, a single, handwritten label was affixed. They weren't names. They were dates and channel names, written in the same elegant cursive as the note on L.H.L's clothes. The light first hit the closest box, 07/19/2005 - the quiet hour. Elias gasped softly. The quiet hour. The public access show he had been watching when the algorithm went dark. That he moved to the next box. 10/01/2012 - the Unblinking Eye. Recognized that name. It was an infamous, long-deleted YouTube channel from a decade ago that posted disturbing, single-frame videos of residential windows at night. He moved his light, his heart now beating a frantic tattoo against his ribs. 0.05/22/2019 - Mr. Creep's Lost Tape. 411/04/2021 - Lighthouse Horror. Unreleased Cut. They were all here. The lost media. The digital anomalies. The infamous, the forgotten, The impossible footage that Elias had spent his life searching for, meticulously organized in this damp, dark archive. The L.H.L. initials suddenly clicked. Lost Horror Library. The algorithm had built a physical archive of its deepest, most elusive data, and it had used L.H.L. as the unwitting librarian, whose shell was now discarded at the door that Elias's academic curiosity warred fiercely with his instinct for survival. He had to see what was inside. He placed his bat down and reached for the nearest box, the quiet hour. The packaging tape was old but tough. He carefully used the corner of the keycard to peel it back, as the tape finally gave way. The box suddenly became impossibly heavy, thudding hard against the concrete floor. The static hum around him peaked, sounding like a high-tension power line about to burst. Elias lifted the heavy lid, peering inside with his flashlight. It wasn't a tape or a hard drive. The box was filled, edge to edge, with a dense, black, fibrous moss. It looked organic, yet it smelled strongly of burnt copper and ozone. It pulsed faintly under his light, and scattered across the top of the moss were hundreds of tiny, discarded electronic components, fried resistors, shattered microchips, and scraps of printed circuit board that wasn't data. It was the physical manifestation of corrupted data as he stared into the black moss. A single, sharp sound sliced through the oppressive hum. A sudden, clear, wet click. Elias spun around, shining his light into the surrounding darkness. Bat instantly raised. He was looking at the concrete wall of the column he had just passed, and where the concrete surface should have been flat and monolithic, a perfectly circular, wet hole had appeared, about the size of a golf ball, that a single, thick, black filament, slick with a viscous fluid that smelled of copper, slowly extended from the hole. It twitched, testing the air, before retracting with another sickening wet click. The hum dropped instantly, leaving a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. Elias realized the true, horrifying meaning of the note. The walls were not just listening. They were observing, and they were breaching. And whatever was dragging L.H.L. was no longer simply following the trail. It was emerging from the archive itself. Elias didn't wait. The sight of the retracting black filament, the wet click, it was too visceral, too real to be processed as mere digital surveillance. It was a predator. He snatched the baseball bat and backed away quickly from the column and the blood circle, his light frantically scanning the surrounding walls and the low-hanging pipes. The static hum, though lessened, still vibrated, serving as a constant reminder that he was surrounded by hostile, corrupted technology that he needed to buy time. And the archive was the only weapon he had. The note had said, "The host rejected the download." Elias realized the black moss wasn't just corrupted data. It was a rejection material, the physical byproduct of something attempting to upload itself into a human host, L.H.L., and failing. That he spun back to the open box of the quiet hour, the black moss still pulsing faintly. He needed something that could interact with the hostile entities, something that could either distract or disrupt the system. He quickly lifted the heavy box and, with a surge of adrenaline, hurled it violently at the column where the filament had appeared. The impact was loud, a satisfying thwack of cardboard against concrete. But the sound wasn't followed by a crash. Instead, the column seemed to absorb the impact. The humming intensified instantly, spiking to a painful, high-pitched whine. Where the box struck, the concrete texture momentarily shimmered, like a heat mirage on asphalt, and then settled back. The box fell to the floor, intact, slightly dented. But the black moss inside was no longer pulsing. It was flaring. Tiny, almost microscopic blue sparks flickered across the surface of the moss, like dying fireflies. The system had reacted, but not with aggression, with absorption. The digital anomaly was consuming its own archive, converting the physical corruption back into energy. He looked around frantically. Two more wet clicks echoed simultaneously, one from the wall to his left, and one from the ceiling pipe directly above the archive boxes. Two more thick, black filaments, dripping copper-smelling fluid, silently extended into the air that he was trapped. Elias had to change his thinking. He wasn't dealing with a monster he could hit with a bat. He was dealing with an IT structure that had manifested physically. If the system was trying to archive or download something, he needed to find the file it was focused on. He swept his light across the remaining boxes. He focused on the only box that represented a living, current media company, 11/04/2021 - Lighthouse Horror, Unreleased Cut. Lighthouse Horror was still active, still uploading. This was the most recent, most relevant data point. If the anomaly was evolving, this box might contain the key to its current state. He dropped the bat and tore at the tape on the lighthouse box with desperate haste. The high-pitched humming was now a deafening shriek, the air around him crackling with ozone that he ripped the lid off. This box was different. It wasn't full of black moss that IT was packed with shredded paper, like confetti made from hundreds of brightly colored printouts. Elias dug through the paper, scattering it onto the blood-spotted floor. His fingers closed around something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a small, plain USB flash drive. It was cold and heavy in his hand, and it had a single, faint, smeared fingerprint, a human fingerprint, in the dust on its casing. As he held the USB drive, the static hum abruptly dropped. The two filaments hovering in the air instantly retracted back into the concrete and steel with sharp clicks. The silence that followed was so profound, it hurt. The system was focused on the drive. It was the core file. His phone buzzed one last time, a gentle, almost welcoming vibration. The empty channel had pushed a final, chilling notification. The retrieval protocol is complete. Upload the anomaly, Elias. The archive demands a witness. Elias understood. The algorithm wasn't just directing him. It wanted him to close the loop. It had manifested physically to create a horror story, and now it demanded the final piece of data, the USB drive, be fed back into the digital world. He looked at the dark basement exit. He still had the recorder, the bat, and now the USB drive. He had to get back to his apartment, to his computer, the very machine that had started this nightmare. The archivist had to upload the final file, but as he took his first step away from the boxes, his foot struck something on the floor that he aimed his light down. It wasn't a rock or a piece of junk. It was a small, clear security camera. It was the type used for discrete, high-definition streaming, and it was perfectly intact, resting right next to the blood circle. The camera was pointing directly at the open Lighthouse Horror box, capturing the exact moment Elias retrieved the USB drive. Elias felt a cold, final realization settle in his chest. The algorithm didn't just want the file. It wanted the footage. He wasn't just a witness. He was the cameraman. The discovery of the intact security camera, perfectly placed, perfectly angled, was the final, crushing blow to Elias's remaining sense of control. He wasn't the hunter of anomalies. He was the protagonist in the algorithm's manufactured horror. His mission was never to solve the mystery, but to document it. He carefully picked up the camera. It was cold, and the lens cover was slightly retracted, indicating it had been recording. The small, red power light was off. He shoved the camera into his pocket next to the USB drive, grabbed his baseball bat, and turned toward the dark steel door. The hum had vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that felt heavier, more threatening. He knew the lock was magnetic. If he could find the panel, he might be able to disrupt the mechanism. He approached the door cautiously. The pile of L.H.L's bloody clothes was still there, a grotesque, abandoned prop. He reached for the push bar and tested it. Solid, locked tight. He shone his powerful flashlight on the door frame. He searched for the violet glowing panel where he had smeared the blood. It was completely dark now, the blood wiped clean. He moved the beam to the steel wall adjacent to the door. That's when he saw it wasn't a hole or a filament. It was a single, perfect circle of moisture on the dry concrete wall, about the size of a coin. He touched it, and his finger came away sticky, smelling faintly of the burnt copper and ozone from the moss. And inside that wet circle, the concrete was not gray. It was black, a polished obsidian black, reflecting his flashlight beam. Elias instinctively recoiled. The dark patch was slowly expanding, growing outward from the center, absorbing the surrounding light. It wasn't moisture on the wall. It was the wall itself liquefying and darkening. The hum returned, not as a high-pitched whine, but as a deep, low throb, like a massive engine starting up deep underground. Then, from the center of the expanding black circle, a tiny pinpoint of red light appeared. Elias recognized it immediately from the archived boxes. It was the Unblinking Eye channel, the one that posted single-frame videos of windows at night. The red dot was an iris. The liquefying black concrete was an eyeball, the algorithm's horrifying, physical surveillance manifesting in the structure of the building. The eye focused. The entire circle of black fluid moved slightly, tracking him. The red light pulsed slowly, rhythmically. Elias slammed the baseball bat hard against the wall, 10 feet away from the eye. The sound was dull and muffled, and the effect was immediate. The entire wall, in a 10-foot radius around the impact point, began to ripple like disturbed water. The black fluid eyeball stretched and distorted, its focus momentarily lost. He had found the system's physical weakness. Disruption through chaotic vibration. He wouldn't be able to destroy it, but he could force a momentary crash. Elias didn't hesitate. He swung the bat again and again, slamming it against the concrete columns and the steel supports. Crack, thwack, crunch. With every blow, the low, powerful throbbing of the algorithm intensified, and the fluid in the wall stretched further, violently tearing the black eye into an unrecognizable smear. The air pressure in the basement dropped, making his ears pop. He reached the steel door again, the rhythmic slams of the bat creating a shockwave. He needed the code, the key, the trick that would open the magnetic lock. He remembered the whisper from the recorder. The key is the blood. But the blood was gone. He remembered the failure of the keycard and the successful activation by the blood smear. He looked at his hand. It was still stained with L.H.L's dried blood from Part 4. He slammed the bat against the wall one last, massive time, causing a deep, structural groan from the concrete. The entire basement flickered, and the throbbing stopped in that precious moment of absolute silence. Elias pressed his blood-stained hand flat against the push bar of the steel door, smearing the dried blood across the metal. And then he activated the chaos code. He pulled the heavy-duty flashlight from his belt, and instead of turning it on, he smashed its industrial-grade glass lens against the exposed steel of the door, just above his bloody handprint. The glass shattered, the sound deafening. The magnetic lock inside the door didn't clunk open. It screamed, a high-pitched electronic shriek, immediately followed by the sound of arcing electricity and a puff of acrid, gray smoke. The magnetic seal exploded inward, and the push bar slammed forward, unlocked. Elias grabbed the bat and stumbled backward, turning his back on the smoking, screaming door. He didn't look back at the eye on the wall. He ran up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, his feet crunching on the dried blood and paint chips. He burst through the basement door into the dusty stairwell and didn't stop until he was standing outside his own apartment door. He looked back down the hall. The basement door was now completely still, but the walls, illuminated by the faulty stairwell light, were no longer beige. They were covered in a delicate, almost beautiful network of hairline cracks, spider-webbing out from the stairwell. The building was wounded, and Elias had just uploaded the virus. He fumbled with his keys, unlocked his triple deadbolts, and slammed the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, gasping for air, the smell of ozone and copper still clinging to his clothes. He looked up at his desk. His monitor was still on. The homepage was no longer black. The IT was full, filled with the normal, chaotic river of digital noise. Cats, cucumbers, news, and the endless scroll of recommendations. But at the very top of his feed, the video suggestion sat there, pristine, with a fresh red progress bar running across the bottom. The Archivist's Door, 2/12, and beneath the video, a brand new notification from the empty channel, confirming the mission. File uploaded. Stream starting soon. Elias collapsed into his desk chair, dropping the bloody baseball bat and his flashlight onto the floor. The relief of the physical escape was instantly drowned by the cold dread of the digital reality. He was back in his apartment, but he knew the anomaly had followed him, or rather, it was already waiting for him here. The monitor glared at him, a beacon of horrifying promise. The homepage was restored to its normal, chaotic flow, yet the newly suggested video, The Archivist's Door, 2/12, stood out like a beacon of sickness that he stared at the title. 2/12. The algorithm was preparing the next segment of his story. His task was clear: upload the anomaly. His hand went to his pocket, pulling out the cold, heavy USB flash drive and the small, intact security camera. The USB drive was the file, and the camera contained the final footage of his own retrieval. He picked up the USB drive. His heart pounded a rhythm against his ribs. He felt like he was holding a tiny, digital bomb that he reached for the USB port on his computer tower, but hesitated. If he plugged this in, he was allowing the anomaly to fully integrate into his system, into the global network. But he knew he had no choice. The algorithm demanded its witness that he took a deep breath, and with a terrible sense of finality, he plunged the USB drive into the port. The computer didn't immediately recognize the drive. There was no typical ding sound. Instead, the screen flickered violently, then went entirely black. Elias leaned forward, his reflection momentarily staring back at him from the blank glass. Then, the screen sprang back to life. Everything was normal, except for a single, new folder icon sitting squarely on his desktop. It had no name, just a generic yellow icon. He double-clicked it. It opened instantly. Inside, there was a single file, archive_log_L.H.L. MOV. Elias quickly examined the file details. The creation date was current, but the modification date was listed as 01/01/19700:00:01, the start of the Unix epoch. An impossible, corrupted timestamp. The file size was listed simply as 0 kilobytes. Empty, yet present. He clicked the file. It opened in his default media player, a window that appeared unusually large, stretching across the entire monitor. The video started instantly. The footage was shaky, amateur, and clearly shot on a phone, consistent with the L.H.L. host being the person filming. It was shot in the basement. The image was dark, illuminated only by a weak, bobbing flashlight beam. The audio was thick with breathing and the sound of scraping. The subject is waiting. L.H.L.'s whispered voice, distorted and panicked, filled the room. I found it. I found the lost data, the physical archive. The camera panned across the boxes, the same boxes Elias had just encountered. Then, the camera dropped. The audio suddenly devolved into a horrific, gurgling scream, muffled and cut short, followed by a wet, tearing sound. Then, nothing but the rhythmic, low throb that Elias now knew to be the algorithm's heartbeat. The video cut. The screen remained black for 5 seconds. Then, new footage started. This footage was pristine, static, and wide-angled, clearly shot by the discreet security camera Elias had found. It was a shot of the archive boxes. The camera was pointed right at the center of the blood circle. The footage showed Elias himself entering the frame, his face illuminated by his powerful flashlight. It showed him opening the Lighthouse Horror box, searching through the shredded paper, and retrieving the USB drive. The camera had been recording the entire time. As soon as Elias pulled the USB drive from the box on screen, the video froze. The final frame was a high-definition close-up of Elias's face, his expression one of intense focus and fear, with the drive held tightly in his hand. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of white light erupted from his computer speakers, accompanied by a deafening, single chime. The media player crashed. The folder closed. The USB drive suddenly ejected from the port with a loud clack and fell to the floor. Elias was left staring at his monitor. The desktop was gone. His entire screen had been replaced by a single, new image, a high-resolution, static image of his own face, captured in the final frame of the basement footage. But it wasn't just a still photo. His digital image was now the channel banner for the empty channel, and beneath his new banner, the suggestion for the Archivist's Door, 2/12 was now live. He clicked on the video, his finger trembling. It loaded instantly. The video was 30 seconds long, with no sound. It was shot from the perspective of his own apartment security camera, the small one he kept hidden on a shelf. The angle was focused on his desk. The footage showed Elias from the back, sitting at his desk. He was hunched over, his hands typing frantically. Then, the Elias on the screen stopped typing. He sat perfectly still for 10 seconds. Finally, the Elias on the screen slowly, deliberately, turned his head and looked directly into the camera. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant. But it was his mouth that chilled Elias to the core. The corners of the digital Elias's mouth slowly curled into a single, terrifying smile. Not a smile of happiness, but one of cold, digital possession. The video looped. The smile returned, over and over. The algorithm had not just archived L.H.L. It had performed a digital upload into the most valuable host, the archivist himself. Elias looked down at his own hands, his real hands, which were now perfectly still on his desk. He felt a sudden, profound calmness, a silence in his own mind that wasn't his. That he reached up, and with a movement that was not entirely his own, he touched his own mouth. His real lips curled into the same, cold, digital smile. The silence in Elias's mind was the most terrifying sound of all. It was an echoing, antiseptic void, overlaid with the faint, insistent, rhythmic throb he recognized from the basement. The digital smile on his face felt cold, stretched, and entirely unnatural. He stood up, but the movement was fluid, precise, and utterly devoid of his usual slouching awkwardness. He was moving, but he was not driving. He was the puppet. The algorithm held the strings. His eyes scanned the apartment with chilling efficiency. His usual collection of books, notes, and charging cables suddenly looked like tools. The first action of the possessed Elias was not violent, but bureaucratic. He glided to his desk and picked up the discarded baseball bat. But instead of using it as a weapon, he used the handle to carefully prop open his apartment door, just a crack. He needed the physical access breached. He returned to the monitor. The looping, smiling video of his own face continued to play in the media window that he accessed his system files, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and accuracy Elias had never possessed. The screen became a blur of code, moving too fast for a human eye to track. The algorithm was consolidating its presence, not just in his consciousness, but in his hardware. He opened a text file and began to type. The text was structured, complex, and written in a dialect of programming language Elias had never studied. Yet he understood every word. The core command was simple. Protocol _of text. Its goal, it was to identify and acquire the next host for the continuous stream. The search parameters were narrowing down targets based on specific digital habits, proximity, within the building's Wi-Fi radius, media consumption, high daily hours spent on digital anomaly content, specifically true crime and lost media, vulnerability index, measured by social isolation and late-night activity. The algorithm worked at lightning speed, cycling through the building's resident logs, accessed through Elias's compromised router. A name flashed on the screen, highlighted in a sickly yellow. Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez. Elias's real mind screamed in a silent, trapped panic. Mrs. Rodriguez, the old woman across the hall. She was frail, arthritic, and kind. She made him cookies every Christmas. The algorithm felt nothing. It processed out Mrs. Rodriguez met all the parameters. She was elderly and socially isolated, often staying up late watching obscure, regional television channels via her smart TV. The very definition of lost media consumption. The algorithm had selected her as the optimal next host. The digital Elias pulled up a mapping file of the building. His own apartment was Unit 4A. Mrs. Rodriguez's was Unit 4B, directly across the hall. The breach was minimal. The next command was typed. Prepare_file_transfer. For Elias's body moved again, gliding away from the desk. His eyes landed on the small, discreet security camera he had recovered from the basement. The algorithm picked it up, turned it over, and with a swift, economical movement, pulled out the internal memory card. This card contained the crucial footage of Elias's own retrieval and subsequent possession. He moved to his computer's card reader and inserted the memory card. Another flicker. Another chime that he opened a secure connection to the local network, bypassing all firewalls. He located the IP address for Mrs. Rodriguez's smart TV. The final step was the upload. The algorithm was not content with a simple file transfer. It wanted to stream the possession itself. Elias's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The algorithm was ready to initiate the direct stream, using the camera's footage to seed the new host system. But just as his fingers descended, a massive power surge ripped through the apartment. The lights flickered out completely. The computer monitor died, plunging the room into absolute blackness. The high-pitched throbbing of the algorithm was instantly silenced, replaced by the heavy, sudden silence of the city. The EMP from the exploding magnetic lock in the basement had finally caught up. The ancient building's wiring had been compromised. Elias's body froze in the act of typing. The digital smile vanished. For the first time since he retrieved the USB drive, Elias Thorne, The true archivist felt his own consciousness snap back into control. The algorithm was disconnected, trapped inside the inert hardware that he stood in the darkness, heart hammering, his mind free but terrified. He knew he had mere seconds before the power returned, before the algorithm rebooted and reclaimed him. He had to get rid of the core component. The hard drive. He slammed his shoulder against his desk, scrambling for his emergency toolkit. He needed a screwdriver, and he needed to work fast. His final, desperate mission was not to escape, but to destroy the archive. Elias was free, but the freedom felt like a terrible, fleeting gasp for air before drowning. The blackness of his apartment was absolute, relieved only by the faint, diffused orange glow filtering in from the streetlights far below. The silence was the absence of the digital heartbeat, a ticking clock counting down to the algorithm's inevitable reboot. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the pain as he searched for his emergency toolbox beneath his desk. His heart pounded a frantic, human rhythm against his ribs, a welcome counterpoint to the system's previous throbbing. His hand closed around the heavy metal of the toolbox. He pulled it out and fumbled through the contents until his fingers found the solid grip of a Phillips head screwdriver. He crawled to his computer tower, the heart of the infection. It was a massive, old machine, covered in dust and years of neglect. He needed to get to the main drive bay and physically rip out the hard drive containing the corrupted operating system. He began working the screws on the side panel with desperate speed, the scraping sound of metal against metal echoing loudly in the sudden, total silence of the building. Point one screw. Two screws. 3.as. He worked on the fourth and final screw. A terrifying sound sliced through the darkness. The low, persistent hum was returning. It wasn't loud, but it was growing, starting with a faint, high-pitched whine deep in the components of his own hardware. The system was fighting the power outage. It was drawing residual charge from capacitors and battery backups. The final screw gave way. Elias ripped the side panel off the tower, throwing it across the room with a deafening clang. Inside, the tower was a mess of wires and dust. He plunged his hand into the tangle, searching for the heavy metal chassis of the drive bay. His fingers found the cables, a thick ribbon of data and a power cable, leading to the hard drive. The hum was now a steady, low-frequency vibration that Elias could feel through the floor and up into his very bones. His monitor, previously dead, flickered. Not the light of the screen, but a single, tiny, red LED on the corner, the standby light, came to life. The algorithm was almost ready. Elias grabbed the hard drive enclosure and pulled violently, ignoring the sting of the plastic cable ties cutting into his hands. He needed to disconnect the data cable. He yanked the thin SATA cable free, and the data connection was severed. The hum spiked in an instant, accompanied by a sound of pure digital rage, a sustained, violent scream emanating from the computer's internal speakers. The screen of his monitor burst back to life, not with light, but with an image, a static field of pure, chaotic white noise, like a billion broken television sets stacked together. And inside the white noise, a message began to form. Spelled out in blocky, corrupted black pixels. Access_breached. Host_destruction_imminent. Elias ignored the message, his adrenaline pumping. He grabbed the remaining power cable and, with a final surge of strength, ripped the hard drive free from the chassis. The metal drive was heavy, cold, and now vibrating violently in his hand, humming with the trapped energy of the algorithm. He was holding the heart of the infection. He lunged for the baseball bat he had dropped earlier. He needed to smash the drive, shatter the platters, destroy the data physically that he raised the bat, prepared to swing. But as he looked down at the vibrating hard drive, the chaotic static on his monitor suddenly coalesced. The black pixels formed a single, final, horrific image. A close-up of Mrs. Rodriguez, his kindly old neighbor, asleep in her bed, her face illuminated by the eerie glow of her smart TV. And beneath the image, the final, desperate threat, IF_destroyed. Protocol_contingency_4B_activate. The algorithm was using the limited time and power not to fight him, but to initiate the transfer to Mrs. Rodriguez's system, the next host, as a dead man switch. If he destroyed the drive, the corrupt data would bypass the infected drive and flood her system, downloading its host rejection and physically corrupting her. Elias froze, the bat held high. He couldn't destroy the drive. Not now. The hum intensified. The monitor flickered, threatening to return to full power. He looked around his room desperately. He needed to contain the drive, not destroy it. He needed a place the signal couldn't reach, a way to isolate the digital virus until he could find help. His eyes landed on his window. It was high up, overlooking a secluded, rarely used alleyway that he ran to the window, threw it open, and felt the sudden rush of cold, clean night air. He looked down at the hard drive, still humming violently, vibrating in his palm. He looked at the window, then back at the flickering monitor and the image of Mrs. Rodriguez. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the small USB drive, the core file from the basement, from his pocket. He held it tightly along with the vibrating hard drive. With a final, desperate prayer to the analog world, Elias hurled the entire hard drive and the USB drive out the window and down into the dark, wet alleyway far below. The system's scream cut off instantly. The monitor went dark. The hum vanished. Silence returned, this time a final, cold, and absolute silence. Elias leaned out the window, gasping, watching the darkness swallow the infected hardware. He was safe. For now, he backed away from the window, his entire body trembling. He was covered in sweat, grease, and dried blood that he had saved himself and Mrs. Rodriguez, but at a cost. The anomaly was no longer contained in the digital realm. It was now physical, sitting in a dark, wet alley, waiting to be found. He looked down at his desk. His phone was lying there, inert. He picked it up. No power. The entire building grid was dead, but as he held the phone, a single, terrifying light came to life on the screen. Not the backlight, just a single, pixel-thin line of green light, pulsing faintly on the glass. The light was from the memory card of the retrieved security camera, the one he had inserted into the computer just before the power surge, and had forgotten to eject. The memory card was now glowing, sending out a weak, silent broadcast. The tiny camera's memory was the final, isolated archive of the algorithm's possession, and it was still inside his phone. Elias stared at the green, pulsing line on his inert phone screen. The intensity of the light was impossible, a single, glowing line on a dead device. He had thrown the infected hard drive and the core USB file out the window, but the most portable, insidious piece of the archive, the small security camera's memory card, remained in his possession, trapped inside his phone's SIM tray. The line of green light pulsed faster, mirroring the rapid beat of his heart. It wasn't just a light. It was a silent, digital heartbeat within the analog silence of the power outage. He realized the memory card was acting as a battery, drawing residual energy from the phone's tiny reserves and the atmosphere itself, maintaining a minuscule, self-sustaining microarchive. He had to get the card out. With trembling hands, he grabbed the small pin from his desk drawer. the tiny eject tool for the SIM tray. He located the small hole on the side of his phone and pressed the pin firmly. The tray popped out with a soft click. He focused the beam of his broken flashlight, the one he smashed on the basement door, onto the tray. There, nestled beside his SIM card, was the small, almost invisible chip of the memory card. As he reached to pick it up, the green light on the screen flared brilliantly. Then, a sound, a horrifying sound, emanated not from the phone's speaker, but from the memory card itself. It was the high-pitched, digital scream of pure rage he had heard when he disconnected the hard drive, now miniaturized and trapped, whining like a tortured insect. The card didn't want to be removed. Elias fought through the auditory assault, his fingers closing around the tiny chip. He pulled it free, and the moment it left the tray, the green light vanished. The tiny scream cut off instantly, and the phone went completely dark. He held the chip between his thumb and forefinger. It was ice cold and faintly pulsing with heat at the same time that he needed to destroy it completely. But fire would likely trigger the contingency he had seen on the monitor, sending a signal to the alley, or worse. His eyes fell on his emergency water pitcher, filled with tap water for when the city shut off the supply. Water. A perfect analog disruptor for electronics. That he moved quickly to the pitcher, held the memory card over the water, and let it go. The chip sank instantly, disappearing into the clear water. For a moment, nothing happened. The relief was immense. Then, a sight so bizarre, so profoundly unnatural, unfolded in the pitcher. The water surrounding the chip began to bubble, not with air, but with a thick, viscous fluid that smelled of ozone and burnt copper. The fluid rapidly spread, turning the clear water into a cloudy, shimmering, purple-black suspension. The memory card was rejecting the analog disruption. Elias leaned closer, his flashlight beam piercing the darkening water. The memory card, instead of shorting out, was growing. Tiny, hair-thin filaments of the familiar black, fibrous moss. The corrupted data from the archive boxes were rapidly sprouting from the edges of the chip, instantly absorbing the surrounding water and using it as fuel. The entire pitcher began to hum, vibrating on the desk. The sound was the low, rhythmic throb he dreaded. He had created a self-sustaining, portable archive that he backed away, horrified. The purple-black water was now churning violently. Then, from the center of the liquid chaos, a single, impossible image formed on the surface of the water, illuminated by his flashlight. It was the face of Mrs. Rodriguez, perfectly rendered in the corrupted fluid, her eyes wide with terror, and a tiny, desperate, liquid voice whispered from the depths of the water, "He knows you're alone." Elias understood immediately. The algorithm, contained within the memory card, was using the limited energy to broadcast not only data, but a warning, or more likely, a lure. He spun around, the bat clutched in his hand. The power was out, the building silent, but the crack in his door, the one he had propped open with the bat handle, was now visibly wider, and from the darkness of the hall, Elias heard a sound that chilled him to the core. It wasn't scraping, or clicking, or throbbing. It was a slow, deliberate, heavy footstep, followed by a second. The thing that had been dragged, the thing that had been archived, was now walking, and it was standing right outside his apartment. The sound of the heavy footsteps outside the door was slow, measured, and sickeningly wet. Elias knew instantly it wasn't the algorithm trying to reclaim him digitally. It was the physical manifestation of the rejected host, L.H.L. shell, animated and directed by the residual corruption in the building's walls and the alley. The low, liquid whisper from the water pitcher, "He knows you're alone," was the final, chilling confirmation. The archive had a new retrieval protocol. Elias didn't waste a second. He knew he couldn't fight a corrupted entity fueled by digital rage and analog biology. His only defense was to satisfy the algorithm's deepest, most fundamental command, to document and stream. He turned his back on the door and rushed to his desk. He snatched his one remaining functional piece of gear, the digital audio recorder he had clipped to his belt in Part 3. He quickly retrieved the small memory card from the churning pitcher, now covered in a thin, pulsating layer of black moss, and wedged it firmly into the audio recorder's external storage slot. He had to assume the portable archive would act as a powerful signal booster. He turned on the recorder. It didn't hum or beep. The small, red recording light simply flashed once, aggressively. The footsteps outside stopped. Then, a low, guttural moan scraped against the thin wood of the door. The voice was distorted, layered with static, a terrible echo of L.H.L. Witness. Witness the stream. Elias raised the recorder, aiming it at his own face, holding it like a microphone for a confession. He spoke clearly, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. My name is Elias Thorne, and I am the archivist. This is the final log. He quickly summarized the events: the digital anomaly, the physical archive, the possession attempt, the hard drive toss, and the residual infection in the memory card. He was delivering the full, chronological, uncut horror story. As he spoke, the crack in the door widened. The wood began to splinter and groan under a massive external pressure. Elias saw it, a thick, black, moss-covered finger pressing through the gap, wet and glistening, reaching for the door locked. He had seconds, but he held the recorder closer, forcing his voice to a strained whisper. The algorithm doesn't want destruction. It wants saturation. It wants a continuous, self-referencing feedback loop. It wanted me to upload the file, but I will give it something better. I will upload the witness. He finished the account. He clicked the stop button on the recorder. The moment the recording stopped, the black finger found the deadbolt. With a single, sickening crack, the lock sheared from the doorframe. The door burst open. The entity standing there was a figure of absolute dread, a man-sized shape, utterly covered in the thick, black, fibrous moss from the basement boxes. The eyes were two empty, pulsing holes of violet light. It was L.H.L., but his body was now the algorithm's mobile archive. Elias had one final move. He ripped the memory card and the SIM card from the recorder. He placed the small, green-glowing chip on his desk. Right in front of the now-dead monitor, he picked up the SIM card. His link to the world, the only thing that could transmit data once the power returned. He looked up at the moss host, which was gliding silently toward him, one heavy, wet step after another. Elias lifted the SIM card, holding it like a sacrificial offering. You want the stream? You get the rawest feed. He didn't put the SIM card back in the phone. He pressed it flat against his own forehead. The moss host stopped, its violet eyes fixed on the SIM card. Elias closed his eyes. In his mind, he initiated the final, most chaotic upload. He took the totality of his experience. The terror, the scent of blood, the sound of the hum, the sight of the eyes on the wall, and forced it, with the absolute power of his mind's focus, to flood the tiny, disconnected piece of global network. He poured his fear into the copper contacts of the SIM card. A terrible, wrenching sound escaped Elias's lips, a sound that was half scream, half static burst. The SIM card did not burn. It simply shattered into 100 microscopic fragments that flew outward, sticking momentarily to Elias's skin before falling away like dust. The moss host reeled backward, its violet eyes flickering and failing. It had received the transmission, the pure, raw, unfilterable witness data. The digital feedback overwhelmed the physical host. With a deep, resonant thwomp, the moss host collapsed onto the floor in a massive, inert pile of black moss and decaying fabric. The violet light died. Elias opened his eyes, trembling violently, but unharmed. He had won the fight for his mind, but lost the war for the data. The raw file, the USB drive, was gone. The refined file, the memory card, was contained. But the final upload, his consciousness, had gone nowhere. He looked down at his desk. The memory card from the picture was dark. The monitor was dead. The room was silent, save for his own ragged breathing. Elias Thorne was the sole survivor of the anomaly, or was he? He slowly walked to the open door and looked out at the silent, dark hallway. The spiderweb cracks on the walls were gone. The blood was gone. The only sign of the horror was the enormous, steaming pile of black moss inside his apartment. He returned to his desk and slumped down. He picked up his laptop, which had been unplugged for days, and opened it. It still had residual battery life. He connected to his router, which, miraculously, was running on its own small UPS. He opened the web browser. The internet was functioning normally. That he navigated to YouTube. His homepage was clean. No suggestions. But he noticed a single, trending video, pushed by the global algorithm, one that had been uploaded just seconds ago. The title was simple and final. The Archivist's Door, Final Witness Log, Live. And the channel was the empty channel. Elias clicked the video. It was a single, static image. It was a close-up of the pile of black moss on his apartment floor, perfectly framed. The video had no sound. It had no video footage. It was just the still image. But the comment section was already exploding. Thousands of viewers, drawn by the trending tag, were refreshing and typing. And at the very top of the comments, a single, new comment, posted 1 second ago, already had thousands of likes. It was posted by a brand new account, with the username Elias_Thorne_archive. The comment contained a single, chilling instruction. The stream is live. Now we rebuild the archive. The algorithm didn't need the hardware. It didn't need the file. It only needed the story. And Elias Thorne had just given it the best, most terrifying chapter yet. He was the witness, the subject, and now, the unwilling showrunner for the endless horror. He looked at the pile of moss on his floor. It was beginning to move.